Well, hey, AP Bio students, it's Mrs. Shelton here, and I'm going to talk you through the main points of Chapter 43. This is actually our very last chapter of Unit 8 on ecology. So, Chapter 43 is Global Ecology and Conservation Biology. I also like to call it How People Are Stupid, but also How People Are Trying to Save the World. With this, what I highly suggest you have out is you should have out your Chapter 43 notes outline. You will see from this Chapter 43 now notes outline, there's not a lot of content to it. And again, like some of the other chapters in the ecology unit, it makes a lot of sense once you hear the terms and you see examples from it. So with that, grab your Chapter 43 notes outline and your textbook if you want to follow along in your textbook as we go through then the chapter 43 main pieces of information. So what you actually get is this cool picture of this rock gecko. So this rock gecko was actually just discovered about 10 years ago. But with this, they actually call it the psychedelic rock gecko because of all of its colors. So with this, one of the opening questions is really, is this gecko going to survive? And we'll talk about some of the reasons why it is expected that this is a gecko that probably will end up going extinct, unfortunately, for some of the human impact reasons along those lines. So that's what we're going to be talking about when we do talk global ecology. We are going to be talking a lot about biodiversity and also the human threats to biodiversity. So these are the you must knows from the test prep review series. There's only 2 pages of review in that test prep series to go back over. So very easy reading. And then this is also the end of topic 10. So what you can also do is within that topic 10 is answer those questions, those practice questions for ecology too. But for the you must knows for this chapter, we need to talk about biodiversity and the major human threats to it. We need to know how human actions are changing the earth. And we also need to be able to predict consequences of both the local and the global ecosystems in response to specific human activities. So based on human activities, can we predict what might be happening in that particular ecosystem? So those are our you must knows that we need to have. In this particular chapter, there are 6 sections, but within those 6 sections, there's just little bits of information from each of them that we really need to be focusing on. Now, if we take a look here, what do you guys see in this particular picture? What you're seeing is that this has been land that is being used for agricultural purposes. Probably what you didn't realize is that this was actually tropical rainforest that had a tremendous amount of biodiversity, but then got stripped in order to then be able to be used for agriculture. And some of the things that end up happening when you do strip out that tropical rainforest is most of the nutrients were actually in the vegetation that get hauled away. So what ends up happening oftentimes is the soil ends up being very nutrient poor and can't sustain some of those farming practices without remediation over the long haul. Now, what you're also going to read in the opening is they're going to talk to you about just some of the animals and organisms that have gone extinct. When we think about some of these extinctions, just in the United States alone, in a very short period of time, it has actually been counted that there are 200 extinct species of plants in the United States within just a 50-year time period. 12% of birds and 21% of mammals are actually threatened species at this particular point in time. So extinction matters, and this loss of biodiversity matters that we need to make sure that we are understanding. Now, when we say biodiversity, there's 3 different levels of biodiversity that you really do need to be aware of. So from the species, biodiversity, ecosystem, biodiversity, and genetic biodiversity, these are, when we say biodiversity, it means the diversity of life, obviously. So we've talked a lot about this importance of genetic diversity within any particular population. This loss of genetic diversity is not going to be allowing for that particular population to adapt to changes in their environment. When we talk now about species diversity, that species diversity is going to be talking about all the different organisms that actually exist in that area that are all part of the food web and all work together in those particular communities. And then when we refer to our ecosystem diversity, now we're looking at the whole ecosystem as far as all the different microbiomes that exist in there, the microecosystems that exist in there, in order to, again, have this diversity for species to be able to adapt to, move to as the environment changes. So with biodiversity, we need to understand. So here's diagrams from your book, again, recognizing these different levels of biodiversity from genetic to species to this community or ecosystem diversity within a region is what we need to understand. But this is really a key part that we need to be addressing is why is biodiversity important? And we talk about biodiversity, but as far as why is it important, actually, there's just numerous reasons why. And it really has to do with that interconnectedness of all life on this particular planet. So, whether or not it is from the interactions within food chains, whether it's the essential goods and medicine, raw material, whether it's this aesthetic or spiritual value, biodiversity allows for this adaptation as the environment changes, but it's also an important part of just important resources that we as humans absolutely need to have. Now, here's just another slide. Why is biodiversity important? And it's not just about the aesthetics, but it brings stability to an ecosystem. It creates more niches for living things. It encourages and allows for these symbiotic relationships between all living things. Effective food webs would be something else. Here's another diagram as well that kind of simplifies it. That biodiversity provides us foods, fuels, fibers, helps in kind of recycling, climate waste, and pollution, support some of these processes when we talk about the water cycle and some of the nutrient cycling that exists. And then it's just opportunity for us to enjoy that biodiversity as well. So you don't need a laundry list that you need to know of why is biodiversity important, but you should just empirically understand why we need biodiversity at the species level, why do we need it at the genetic level, and then why do we need it at the ecosystem level. And here's one more diagram here that's also addressing this biodiversity, but now it's really addressing the threats to biodiversity. And this is what we also need to be able to understand is how humans are actually threatening biodiversity. And so in your textbook, we talk about those threats to biodiversity as being habitat loss, introduced species, overharvesting, and global change. Now, here it's talking more specifics in here, this overexploitation, pollution, genetic pollution, habitat destruction, diseases. There's all sorts of threats that humans impose to biodiversity. Now, in this particular diagram is actually really showing you this habitat loss. This becomes a major issue when we start building is we've limited the habitat that a lot of these organisms that are used to living in these hills in California can actually even utilize anymore. And then when they also have to be able to migrate over long distances, you have things like cougars in our area that end up becoming nuisances because a cougar range is not just limited to this one little mountain range. It's got to be able to go to lots of different habitat and lots of different areas. This particular picture, it just looks like a cool vine over a blue truck, but this actually is an example of an invasive species or an introduced species. Now, we don't have kudzu, and kudzu should be something that you guys look up, but kudzu is actually a vine that is incredibly invasive in the south and also east coast. This vine is virtually indestructible, and with that, this vine takes over. There's not many herbivores that can actually eat from this vine whatsoever, but this vine then takes over all the other producers in particular habitats. But this was an introduced species that somebody thought, oh, cool, look, this pretty vine from some other continent, and let's bring it over here. Well, it took over and it's ruined the ecosystem, and it's a result of habitat loss and nutrient loss too. So kudzu is something you guys should recognize too. Now, this is one that always makes me cry. It is when we talk about over harvesting. Here, just this poaching and over harvesting. With elephants. I mean, the number of elephants that have declined in the past 50 years just because of poaching, all for the ivory. So with this, we have a tremendous loss. And when you think of an elephant being something that's so important to the ecosystem and being that supporting structure, maybe in a keystone species in some areas, but just this overexploitation or overharvesting is absolutely a huge human impact. We see that in fishing. Here they're actually showing you tuna, but actually a really good example would be shark fins, and the overfishing for shark fins is something else that ends up happening. Now, a fourth threat to biodiversity that your textbook talks about is it talks about just global change. And so we'll talk a little bit later about global climate change as far as temperature changes and population sizes, but we can actually even see pH changes in certain areas. That's going to start affecting when we actually see this pH actually increasing. That changes what organisms can live there from that producer level all the way on up to. But global change is also going to be a factor. So from 43.1, make sure you're understanding different levels of biodiversity, why biodiversity is important, and then be able to identify what are some of those threats to biodiversity. Now, in section 2 of your book, 43.2, it actually is talking about population conservation. And with this population conservation, there's actually one term I need you guys to address that might be a little bit new to you, and this is referred to as an extinction vortex. And an extinction vortex, when we actually have these endangered species and the population gets so small, we actually know that extinction will end up happening. Because that population being so small, there's going to be inbreeding, genetic drift, there's going to be loss of that genetic variability, there's going to be lower fitness, lower reproduction, higher mortality, and that's just going to end up turning into this vortex that leads to smaller and smaller populations and then ultimately to extinction. So just make sure you kind of recognize what that means when we talk about a extinction vortex that small populations might be in. Now, in 43.3, this is actually just really interesting and good reading when it actually talks about regional conservation. And so with regional conservation and trying to help sustain biodiversity, humans are actually learning from their mistakes and trying to implement these broad-based conservation mechanisms in order to be able to coexist. What you're seeing here, so this is not just a pretty bridge. This is actually what's referred to as a movement corridor. Because if you've ever driven, and a drive that maybe some of you guys have taken over to Salt Lake City is you've taken Interstate 80. Well, that's just a vast open freeway. Well, you have lots of deer that need to cross from one side of the freeway to the other side of the freeway. So that was dangerous actually to the migrating deer, to the elk, also to some of those other animals, and also dangerous to the drivers as well. So by creating these movement corridors, these pathways for these animals to be able to safely cross through their habitat, this has actually been huge for maintaining this biodiversity in these particular areas. Now, something else you guys should recognize is that there are certain regions that are referred to as biodiversity hotspots. And when we say it's a biodiversity hotspot, these hotspots end up being these very, very small regions that have a very, very high amount of endemic species. And when we say endemic species, it means that that species is only found in that specific location. So you can actually see in here some of the terrestrial and some of the marine biodiversity hotspots where we're only going to find certain species in these areas. So when we have these biodiversity hotspots, it's actually really important that countries actually establish some of these protected lands or some of these nature reserves in order to make sure these hotspots remain intact and we don't lose those endemic species from our planet. So with this, I'll talk again about Costa Rica in a little bit, but Costa Rica is a fantastic example of actually being able to build sustainable development. Costa Rica actually maintains with their protected land and protected ocean, they recognize that their biodiversity is actually economically a major part of their GDP. Ecotourism comes in, and with that, just by leaving these as natural preserves and allowing people to just see that natural habitat, they recognize that that biodiversity is a huge, tremendous value that for them economically, but then also for the species richness and the resources that they're able to glean from these areas too. Now, when we talk about chapter 43.4, with 43.4, that heading is actually talking about the Earth is changing rapidly as a result of human actions. So when we do talk about some of these human actions and some of this negativity that's actually occurring, here's one example that you guys should know. Um, this is the coastline here. We actually see down here in Texas, but what's actually being depicted here is this is a eutrophication in the ocean, nitrogen runoff. So this would be nutrient enrichment is often something that ends up happening that people are doing for agricultural purposes. And so when we get these high amounts of nitrogen, then we get these algal blooms. And so with that, we can also even have this eutrophication. We talked about it last chapter and talk about it again, but we also get these blooms and this ultimate decrease in oxygen and nutrients in these aquatic ecosystems later on. We also get soil erosion from poor farming practices. Fortunately, most farmers, I mean, they are invested in making sure that their land is well maintained for centuries. And so once they understand some of the practices that are harming the land, most farmers are huge advocates for sustainable agriculture and changing their practices in order to make sure that they are working being environmentally conscious for that sustainability piece. Now, another concept that you guys should know is you should know about biological magnification. So when we talk about food chains, a lot of times we end up having things like small amounts of pollutants that now at this phytoplankton or zooplankton level, at the cellular level, this particular concentration of PCBs, so this is a particular chemical, that it's in small amounts to these little organisms, but now, when we move along the food chain, because these smelt are going to be eating high quantities of the zooplankton, it starts magnifying the amount of concentration there. And then these lake trouts are eating the smelt and they're eating large concentrations. So now we get this magnification that ends up happening. And now, by the time we get to these seabirds that are eating the lake trout, well, now their concentration of these chemicals is really huge. And what ends up happening with something like DDT or PCBs is that ends up decreasing then the fitness of these particular birds because what they find is the eggshells are super weak, and so these eggshells are not sustainable, and so the reproduction of the birds ends up decreasing because of this biological magnification. This is something that happens. We're going to watch a documentary on orcas in the Pacific Northwest. This is an issue with orcas and their reproductive sustainability as well, because of this biological magnification that ends up happening with these tertiary and quaternary consumers. Now, just another human impact. This is one your book talks about that really talks about how we're actually seeing lots of pharmaceuticals, we're seeing lots of antibiotics, we're seeing lots of hormones that end up getting into our lakes and rivers, and just really understanding how these pharmaceuticals, improper waste and improper overusage, ends up creating this runoff, and we start seeing this impact due to human activity. Now, this particular graph is really trying to show us climate change. And so we can actually see climate change, so the temperature that's actually happening, an average temperature that is going up in correspondence with carbon dioxide levels. What we do know with human activity, one, there's more people on this planet, but that really doesn't have as much impact on the carbon dioxide. But it's this burning of fossil fuels that actually is increasing carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere. Now, why that is significant is we have to make sure that we are understanding what the greenhouse effect is. And so when we talk about carbon dioxide, what we are actually talking about are these greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. And as we increase the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, we know that all of our heat and our energy is coming from the sun, and some of that actually bounces back off and escapes. However, these greenhouse gases will actually absorb it and reflect it and return it back to our land. So when we increase the number of greenhouse gases, we are increasing the amount of this energy that is staying near the Earth's surface, and therefore we are increasing average temperatures. Well, we know that all life is dependent on water levels, on temperature levels. Our wind patterns are affected by that. The polar ice caps are affected by that, which then, as we start getting these changes in the climate, we're getting changes in wind and water and temperature, and that's changing the producers and the organisms that can exist in ecosystems because of this. Now, when we talk about climate change, just be aware that when we address climate change, there's an insert in your book that I would want you guys to take a look at, and it's really just making the connection that when we talk about this global climate change, is that it actually does affect organisms on all different levels. So here it gives you an example of the effect on cells. We're talking here about the effect on an organism. We're talking here about the effect of climate change on populations. Here we're talking about the effect of climate change on communities and ecosystems. So when we talk climate change, we can talk about it from that cellular level all the way up to the change in communities and ecosystems, and have some examples off the top of your head of how climate change is affecting all of those different levels. Now, in 43.5, just in understanding 43.5, we should be aware of this change in human population and human population growth over the course of human history, and recognize that with this, we have to carry this back to that concept of carrying capacity. And what is the carrying capacity of humans on this planet? And make sure we're understanding, are we going to end up surpassing that carrying capacity, or are we smart enough that we can collect enough data and understand that a little bit better and make sure that we're not overpopulating our planet and utilizing all the resources that it has available for us at the risk of the biodiversity on our planet? Now, 43.6, this particular chapter, one, it talks about sustainable development. I told you again, Costa Rica is a classic example to look at when this country actually made a choice that their environment and their ecosystems were their number one resource, and we're going to preserve those. Now, Costa Rica is also fantastic in the fact that they also had the belief that education is vital for our citizens as well. And so they put a priority on sustaining ecosystem and also educating their population. Their life expectancy is greater than the United States. They also have a higher percentage of literate citizens as well. So Costa Rica, I highly suggest you visit. You take advantage of the diverse ecosystem that's there, and also then learn how governments can actually establish that maintaining an ecosystem is actually to the benefit of all people and to their economic success as well. Now, the last term I want to address, this really isn't stuff that is in the textbook, except for the word biophilia. So biophilia is a term that I do want you guys to know. And this really is the definition of that term, biophilia. And this really is the future of protecting our biosphere and protecting our ecosystem and protecting our natural habitats, is we have to recognize that humans are innately drawn to life and the natural world. It just is something that we are born with. So this biophilia, this love of life, is innate in us. We understand innately that our surrounding environment is what sustains us, and without it, we don't sustain. I mean, right now, our world is our home and grocery stores, but we need to make sure that we are getting out and we're exploring nature and we're understanding this piece of nature that we're a part of, because when we recognize its significance to us, then we also want to protect it as well. So, what I would actually encourage, so when you look at a picture like this, I mean, for me, mountain ecosystems to me are just breathtaking. Just the clear water, the fresh air, the greenery, the peaked mountains. It absolutely just brings me calm and brings me peace, and also just kind of takes away some of these stresses. But I also recognize too that I want to make sure that this stays intact. I don't want this to be clear cut and removed. I don't want, lots of buildings to now be built on these mountains. I don't want this water drained or dammed, because when I see it and appreciate it, I want to maintain it and keep it and figure out how I can stay with it for eternity, and humans can again coexist. Now, a couple of quotes I want you guys to just know and take in and think about. Here's an Albert Einstein quote: "Look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything better." I am a firm believer that if we look to see how nature, over the course of the 4 billion years that this Earth has been on this, intact, and life for 3 billion years, and life has figured out a way to solve most of our problems if we actually just look and we understand it, and study what's already been. And that's another example of the importance of biodiversity is when we remove and clear cut just tons of forests and this biodiversity, we lose some of these insights to how to even better ourselves. When you get out in nature, I mean, this is social emotional change, and what changes in your brain because of this biophilia is nature just has a natural calming effect for us. When we start just getting out of our own heads and we start looking at the trees and smelling the fresh air, and we hear the birds or we see the fish, or just in our area right now, we've got the poppies in bloom and lots of wildflowers. We've got the turkey males trying to mate. And so they've got their feathers just out. I mean, it's just one of those things that just kind of reminds you of, okay, life is good and life is beautiful and I enjoy it. And so recognize that nature, it is cheaper than therapy. So get outdoors, especially this time. John Muir for California. I mean, John Muir has been, he was the, the father of ecological conservation in our area. But this is something that I believe is that in every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. So every walk, even if it's the same path that you've been walking for days, there's always something different. There's always something else that you find if you just start looking and trying to understand that. But if you're looking just for exercise, take the earbuds out and just start listening to and observing what's around you. And you're going to get far more out of it than just an exercise. And then again, another John Muir, and this just brings us back to this biophilia that we have, is tug on anything in nature and you'll find it connected to everything else. And we are interconnected. All life is interconnected. We are interconnected in just how energy flows through all living things. We are interconnected in how matter cycles between all living things. And our impact is huge. And we may go to Yosemite and feel like we're an insignificant part of nature, but we're part of it. And that's awesome. And it's amazing. So get outdoors. Here is an app that I highly suggest that you guys use. This app, I love it. It's called All Trails. It's free, just the free version of it. This is just going to show you all different types of hiking trails. You can search those hiking trails in every place that you ever go. It's going to pull up and give you directions to those trails and descriptions of those trails. But to wrap up your ecology, that's going to be my homework over spring break for you, is go get outdoors. Get outdoors, explore, experience, see the world around you and the nature around you. And the biology that we've talked about, you can see it in action every single day, every single moment. So with that, that is chapter 43. That is the end of our ecology unit. So with that, I will talk to you guys soon. And hopefully, again, you take my advice and you get outside and you enjoy it. If anything, just for the therapy and the peace of mind that you get from doing that. But chapter 43 and the ecology unit, we are done with that. See you guys later. Bye.